In the autumn of 1955, in a courthouse in Newport, Rhode Island, 6 cousins went to war over the estate of a woman most of them had barely known. The estate came to $20,113,000. In today's money, that is close to $240 million, and the clerk said it was the largest will the town's probate court had ever recorded. The woman who left it had died that spring in a villa above the sea on the French Riviera at the age of 82. She died a countess. Her full married name, laid end to end, read like a treaty between houses that had never met. Her name was Allene Tew Hostetter Nichols Burchard Royce de Kotzebue. She had been born over a livery stable. Across 82 years, she buried all 3 of her children and 2 of her 5 husbands, divorced a prince, helped make a royal marriage, bought the Newport cottage that had once belonged to Mrs. Astor herself, and stood as godmother to a girl who would grow up to be Queen of the Netherlands. The society pages could set the weddings and the houses and the titles in a tidy column. What none of them ever quite explained was how the girl from the stable came to hold the keys to the grandest gate in American society, the very gate that had been built to keep her out. To understand what Allene Tew spent her life climbing, you have to begin with a ballroom and with a number. In the New York of her youth, society was not a mood or a feeling. Society was a list. At the top of it stood one woman, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, and the list was said to hold 400 names, because 400 was, by legend, the number her ballroom could comfortably hold. If your name was inside the 400, you existed. If it was outside, you could own railroads and coalfields and still find yourself, socially, nowhere at all. The gate was kept by paper. There was the social register, a slim printed book that told the city who counted, and to be dropped from its pages was a fall a person could date to the very season it happened in. There were the lineage societies, the Daughters of the American Revolution chief among them, where a documented ancestor worked like a passport, and where the right pedigree could open a door that money by itself could not. A woman with new money and no grandmother on record could be very rich and still be turned politely away at the threshold. Underneath all of it ran the marriage market, older and franker than any register, and it ran in 2 directions at once. On one side stood American money with no history, wealth made in a single lifetime from bitters or rail or coal, money that could buy almost anything except the one thing its owners wanted, which was to belong. On the other side stood the titled families of Europe, ancient names attached to empty treasuries, a coronet here and a castle there, and no cash to keep the roof on. The exchange between them was well understood, and it was less a matter of shame than a matter of arithmetic. A coal heiress could buy herself a European title. A bankrupt count could buy himself an American future. The daughters were the currency, the mothers were the brokers, and the whole business was conducted in drawing rooms over tea, in the polite grammar of invitations accepted and invitations withheld. Everyone at the table knew the rate, and almost no one said it out loud. Allene Tew came to this gate carrying none of the 3 things it asked for. She had no old money, no old name, and no ancestor anyone had troubled to write down. Her name was on no list. She would spend the next 50 years finding another way through. And the strangest fact of her whole strange life is where that other way finally led. The ballroom that measured the entire closed world of the 400 did not stand in the city at all. It stood in Mrs. Astor's summer cottage in Newport, a house called Beechwood, and by the end of her life the woman who owned it and walked its floor and gave her parties in it was the same child who had grown up over the livery stable. The gate had been raised to shut out precisely a girl like the one born over a stable in a small town in western New York. And yet, by the time most of society had learned her name, she had already walked straight through it, on the arm of one of the richest young men in America. The records do not fully agree on where she was born. Some place her birth in Janesville, Wisconsin, in the summer of 1872. Others, including many of the admirers who came later, insist on Jamestown, New York, the town that liked to claim her as a hometown girl who had made good. Jamestown had every reason to prefer its own version. What is not in dispute is where she grew up and how far below the mansion it stood. Her family had helped found Jamestown, but the founding had not made them rich. Allene grew up first around her maternal grandfather's livery stable on West 3rd Street, and then in a modest house at number 32 Pine Street, while her wealthier cousins lived across town in what the locals simply called the Tew Mansion. The same surname sat over two very different doors. She learned that distance early, and she learned it from the wrong side of it. Then, in 1891, she met Theodore Hostetter. Everyone called him Todd. He was the youngest son of a Pittsburgh family that had struck it enormously rich, a polo player and a yachtsman with a taste for very large bets, and by the measure of the gate, he was a genuine prize. On the 14th of May, 1891, an 18-year-old Allene married him at the Church of the Heavenly Rest in New York. Her biographer, Annegé van der Zeel, writes that Allene was already carrying a child when she walked down the aisle, that this was a hurried wedding as much as a romantic one. The open record does not prove the pregnancy on its own, it is the biographer's account, and it belongs here as her account, not as settled fact. What Allene married into can be measured, and the measure is almost comic held up against a livery stable. The Hostetter money had come from a patent medicine called Hostetter's Celebrated Stomach Bitters, a bottled tonic sold by the case in every corner of the country. Todd's father had taken the bitters money and spread it into railroads, coal, gas, and an oil pipeline, the way the new American rich turned one lucky strike into 5. Some careless accounts call it a champagne fortune. It was nothing so elegant. The bitters were a remedy sold to ordinary people at $1 a bottle, and the whole style of the family was built quietly on that. Todd's country house in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, had to be seen to be believed. It held 25 bedrooms, a wing built as a redwood copy of a pavilion from the Chicago World's Fair, polo grounds, 3 barns, and a private golf course of 9 holes. The girl who had grown up around a livery stable now lived in a house with its own golf course and summered at Narragansett Pier, where Todd became the first commodore of the local yacht club. The Hostetters did not celebrate the match, and neither did the Astor set. To the one, she was an intruder who had gotten lucky. To the other, she was a stranger with no name worth knowing. The resentment followed her for years. She had climbed inside the gate, but she had climbed in as a trespasser, watched coldly from both directions at once. For 11 years the marriage held. There were 3 children, and there were yachts, and there were long seasons at the pier, and Todd built a reputation on the water and at the card table both, the kind of reputation that made one paper call him the boldest plunger New York had ever seen. And then, in the summer of 1902, he caught a cold on his yacht near Larchmont, and the cold turned to pneumonia, and within days the boldest gambler in the city was dead at the age of 31. He left his widow a great deal of money. He also left her something the newspapers had not yet printed. What they had not yet added up was the arithmetic, and the arithmetic gave a widow no comfort at all. Todd Hostetter's estate was valued at $1,349,000. In today's money, that is roughly $48 million. It was a great deal of money. It was also, it turned out, a great deal less than it should have been, because in the last year of his life, Todd had gambled away close to $1 million, something near $36 million now at the tables of the professional gamblers who work the edges of the gilded world. One of those gamblers is supposed to have said of him that he would bet on anything from a dogfight to a boiler explosion. The line comes down to us second-hand through the period press and ought to be checked against the original before anyone carves it in stone. But the losses behind it were real, and they did not die with him. The papers had a name for Todd, and they set it in a headline while the estate was still being counted. They called him the lucky plunger. The luck, the ledger showed, had mostly run the other way. The professional gamblers of that era were not shadowy men in back alleys. They ran famous houses, they were known by name in the sporting papers, and they extended credit to rich young men the way a bank extends a mortgage, patiently and with every intention of collecting. Todd had been exactly the kind of client they prayed for, a man with a great name behind him and no brake on his appetite. When he died, the credit did not die. It simply changed its address from the gambler's ledger to the widow's mail. A widow in her position was an easy mark. The men who came for the estate knew that a public trial would humiliate a family that had spent a generation buying its way toward respectability, and they folded that humiliation into the price they were willing to settle for. The shining life did not so much end as get itemized one claim at a time. One of the gamblers he had lost to did not wait and did not tread softly. He sued the widow and he collected $115,000, about $4 million today, straight out of the dead man's estate. The creditors came before the grave was cold. This is the first thing the gate never advertised about the fortunes that passed through it. The money that had carried the stable girl into Mrs. Astor's world was not a solid vault behind a heavy door. The money was a gambler's balance, thrilling and thin, and the moment its keeper died, it began to leak away to the men he had lost to at cards. In the gilded world, a widow was expected to grieve quietly and let the lawyers settle the accounts, but the accounts here did not settle quietly, they dwindled. Every claim that came in against the estate was a small public reminder that the shining life had been rented, not owned, and that the rent had come due all at once. She was rich, and she was a widow before 30, with 2 surviving children, a settled bill from a card sharp, and a name that half of society still would not fully accept. 2 years later, she married again. The union was so brief and so strange that the newspapers reached for an explanation that sounded like something lifted from the stage. They said she had married to please a dying man. The dying man was not the groom. On the 27th of December, 1904, Allene married Morton Colton Nichols at St. Thomas Church in New York. Nichols was a real estate man, a partner in a respectable New York firm, and otherwise unremarkable. What made the wedding into news was the story pinned to it, that the marriage had been hurried along to satisfy Nichols's aged and ailing father, who wished to see his son settled before the end. One paper printed it flatly as a headline that she had wed to please a dying man. The marriage market supplies a colder way to read the match. A young widow with a name still shadowed by gossip and a shrinking estate was not, on paper, a prize. A quiet, respectable real estate man was not a step up in rank, but he was a step back towards respectability, and respectability was a currency Allene had learned to count. Whatever the true reason, the marriage did not outlive its own explanation. Within about a year, it was finished. By 1905, she had divorced Nichols and taken back the name Hostetter, as though the entire episode were a document to be filed and forgotten. It lasted a single year. Morton Nichols then all but vanished from her story. He would return to it only once, many years later, and only in the pages of a newspaper, and by then the news attached to his name would be very dark. For now, he stepped out of her life as quietly as he had stepped into it, and Allene was left with a lesson that seems to have stayed with her. A small marriage was worse than no marriage at all. The next one would not be small. The next time she married, she chose a man who helped run one of the largest companies on earth. For a few years, she was simply a wealthy widow raising 2 children, and the children were growing up into the very world she had married her way into. In 1911, her daughter Greta made her debut at Sherry's, and that same year, Allene reached higher than the New York season had ever let her reach. She took a house in London for the coronation of King George V, and she travelled on to India for the Delhi Durbar, the vast imperial ceremony where the king was proclaimed emperor before the assembled princes of a subcontinent. The next spring, on the 15th of March 1912, Greta was presented at the British court, brought before the king and queen by the wife of the American ambassador. This was a gate higher than any her mother had married through, the oldest court in Europe, and the stable girl's daughter walked through it on an ambassador's arm. Afterward, a reporter asked the young woman how the presentation had felt. "Really," Greta said, "it was a delightful experience." It is very nearly the only thing any of Allene's 3 children is recorded as having said, in a voice of their own. They sailed home on the Campania that same month. The man Allene married in the middle of these bright years was the steadiest choice she would ever make. Anson Wood Burchard had trained as an engineer at the Stevens Institute of Technology and had risen to become vice chairman of the General Electric Company and chairman of its international business. There had been a small public tangle first, a marriage licence taken out and then withdrawn in the London papers in the November of 1912, before the two of them married quietly at a London registry office that December. Where the gamblers and the real estate men had been chances, Burchard was an institution. A man like that did not need her money, which was in its way the point. For the first time, she was marrying up in name without marrying to be rescued, and the marriage carried her into the top rank of American industry, the world of boards and dividends, and men who advised the government. It was the most conventional choice of her life, and after a gambler and a one-year husband, conventional was a kind of luxury. Her daughter, meanwhile, had married into the diplomatic corps to a young American diplomat named Glenn Stewart. The record keeps him thin. His name survives and little more, which is its own small comment on how these lives were written down. For a few years, the whole household stood on ground that felt, for the first time, like stone instead of sand. Burchard was solid, widely respected and useful to his country. When the World War came, he lent his skill to the office of the United States Director of Munitions, helping turn American industry toward the making of guns. The house was rich, it was respectable, and it was safe. And Allene had a son at Harvard and a daughter married well. And for a little while, the long climb seemed to have reached a place where a person could simply stand still. She had spent 20 years reaching that ledge. And when the autumn of 1918 came, the same war her husband was helping to arm reached out and took both of her children at once. Her son had not waited for his own country to enter the war. Theodore Hostetter, Jr. left Harvard, the class of 1919, and crossed the ocean to enlist in Britain's Royal Flying Corps in 1917, while America was still deciding what to do. On the 27th of September, 1918, he was flying a Sopwith Camel with the 3rd Squadron near the French village of Manières when he was shot down and killed. The German pilot credited with bringing him down was one of the enemy's aces, a man named Robert von Greim. One tradition, repeated near the village but not fixed in any document firm enough to trust, has it that his mother later paid for a stone to mark where he fell. Whether she did cannot be confirmed, and the not knowing is its own kind of portrait of a mother, an ocean away from the field where her son came down. 19 days later, on the 16th of October, his sister Greta died in the influenza that was then sweeping the world and killing, in that single autumn, more people than 4 years of the war had. She was pregnant with twins. The twins died with her. Allene Tew had had 3 children. Werner, who had died as a small child back in 1895. Theodore, shot out of the sky over France. Greta, taken by the fever with her unborn twins in a single grey October. Within about 3 weeks, the last 2 were gone, and there were none. She had begun as a girl the great families would not seat at their tables. She was now a woman with more money than most of them, and no child left to leave $1 of it to. What she did next is the hardest part of her whole record to look at squarely, and it is also the truest to who she was. She did not withdraw into the dark. She kept moving. In 1925, 7 full years after the autumn that took both of her grown children, Anson and Allene Beechwood bought a mansion on Park Avenue at number 690, a house assessed at $530,000, something near $10 million today. The climb did not pause for the graves. It never once did, and that refusal is either the most admirable thing about her or the most frightening, depending on where you happen to be standing when you look at it. And then, in the January of 1927, at the home of a banker friend, Anson Beechwood sat down to dinner and died of what the doctors called acute indigestion at the age of 61. He left an estate of more than $3 million, something near $56 million now. Allene was a widow once more. This time, there were no children in the house behind her, and the thing she reached for next was not in America at all. The next title came courting on the society pages. In the seasons after Beechwood's death, the columns that tracked wealthy Americans in Paris began to link Allene with a European prince. His name was Heinrich XXXIII, Prince Royce of Köstritz, a German of ancient and threadbare rank. He had trained as a physician, served as an officer in the 2nd Dragoon Guards, and worked as a diplomat. And he had once been married to a Prussian princess who was a niece of Kaiser Wilhelm himself. He carried exactly the kind of name the 400 could not manufacture at any price. And he needed exactly the kind of money that Allene, twice widowed, now controlled. The society columns reported the whole Paris courtship for American readers in a warm and flattering key, the way a reputation is polished in print. She bought a house in Paris on the Rue Barbet de Jouy and chartered a houseboat on the Nile, a floating palace called the Indiana, cruising its length with the prince among her guests. In Paris, on the 10th of April 1929, she married him. A few records place the wedding instead in Potsdam, but the reporting of the time puts it in Paris, and that is the version the evidence best supports. The stable girl from Jamestown was now Her Serene Highness Princess Ruth. She had bought a title. She played the part in full, hosting a coming-out party at the Waldorf Astoria for her young stepdaughter. And in that same year, in a suite at the Pierre Hotel, a much older story reached its end. Morton Nichols, her brief second husband, divorced from her 27 years before, took his own life at the age of 62, reportedly to end 2 years of unrelenting pain. She had long since vanished from his life, and the newspapers noted the old connection the way such things are noted in a single passing line. The marriage to the prince did not last either. By the summer of 1935 it was over, and the ending was managed with the kind of discretion that money can buy. The divorce was announced neither by Allene nor by the prince, but by her secretary. Less than a year later, on the 4th of March 1936 in Geneva, she married one more time and climbed one more rung of pure rank. Count Pavel de Kotzebue came from a distinguished Baltic German family that had lost everything it owned to the Bolshevik Revolution, an émigré carrying an ancient title, no country to fasten it to, and years ahead of him as president of the Russian Nobility Association in America, keeping alive the forms of a world that had ceased to exist. Allene was now the Countess de Kotzebue. Around the time of that 5th wedding, she quietly endowed a fund at the Stevens Institute, the engineering school of her 3rd husband, Beechwood. In her life, the dead were never entirely finished. Their names went on doing work. By now, she'd gathered the surnames of 5 husbands and the titles of 2 vanished empires. But the most extraordinary door any of them ever opened for her was one that had been shut before she was even born. A door the Prince Roos had lost in the very year a Dutch princess came into the world. Prince Roos held a strange little place in the plumbing of European succession, and it ran through his mother. Through her orange Nassau blood, the House of Roos stood in the distant line of succession to the throne of the Netherlands. Exactly how close is a point the sources argue over. The grand version, repeated widely, says that Heinrich the 33rd himself stood next in that line until a Dutch princess was born. The more careful version places his elder brother in the spot instead. Either way, the claim was real, and either way it was closed off by a single birth. In 1909, Princess Juliana of the Netherlands was born, and the remote Reuss claim to her throne quietly died in its cradle. And here a coincidence turns into something much harder to shrug off. Across her Paris years, Allene had become a close friend of a German noblewoman named Armgard von Kram. The two women moved in the same expatriate circles of titled Europeans and rich Americans, and a friendship between the mothers of that world was a practical thing, a network of introductions and quiet arrangements. Her friend had a son, a young man named Bernhard, Prince of Lippe-Biesterfeld, of good blood and modest means, precisely the kind of young man the marriage market prized. The exact shape of Allene's hand in what followed is not something the record lets us measure. Whether she was the matchmaker or merely the woman who opened the right doors at the right dinners, the marriage happened, and it happened through her circle. In 1937, Allene helped to arrange the marriage of that young prince to a bride. The bride was Juliana of the Netherlands, the very princess whose birth had years before extinguished her own fourth husband's claim to the Dutch crown. The heiress who had bought her way into a family that once stood near the Dutch throne now stood herself at the making of the Dutch royal marriage. The mechanics of it are almost cruel. A crown had been dangled in front of the family she married into and then withdrawn by an accident of birth. Most people, handed that kind of near miss, spend the rest of their lives telling the story of what almost was. Allene did not tell the story. She went and stood inside it, on the other side, as the friend who helped arrange the very marriage that the lost throne now flowed through. A year later, on the 31st of January 1938, Juliana had a daughter and named her Beatrix. And Allene Tew, the girl born above a livery stable in Jamestown, New York, was named that child's godmother. Beatrix would grow up to become Queen of the Netherlands. She had not been handed a crown. She had been handed the christening of the girl who would one day wear one. The throne that had slipped out of her husband's family came back around to Allene through a side door, not as royal blood, but as the American woman standing beside the cradle of a future queen. She had climbed about as far as an outsider could ever climb, from a livery stable to the very edge of a throne. There was only one gate left in the world that she had never owned. In 1940 she went and bought it. The last gate was a house in Newport on Bellevue Avenue, and its name was Beechwood. Beechwood had belonged to Caroline Astor, the same Mrs. Astor whose list of 400 names had drawn the boundary of the entire closed world that Allene had been born outside of. Its ballroom was not original to the house. Mrs. Astor had commissioned the architect Richard Morris Hunt to add it, a room built to hold, near enough, the very number the great families believed themselves to be. In the October of 1940, Allene and Count Kotzebue bought Beechwood from Mrs. Astor's own grandson. The price that gets repeated does not appear in any record solid enough to trust, so leave the figure out and keep the fact. The house was hers, ballroom and all. Her biographer tells a story about how the young Allene had first slipped past the keepers of that world, that she satisfied the lineage requirements of the daughters of the American Revolution using evidence that had been, to put it gently, improved. It is the biographer's reading, not a document a person can hold in a hand, and it should be carried as exactly that. But if it is true, then the shape of her life is almost too neat to believe. The outsider who once dressed up a pedigree to satisfy Mrs. Astor ended her days owning Mrs. Astor's house, free to walk the length of the ballroom, built to hold the 400, not one of whom could keep her waiting at the door any longer. And she used the room. In 1942, with the world at war again, the Countess de Kotzebue opened Beechwood for a garden party in aid of the Newport chapter of the American Red Cross. That same ballroom, the room that had been the beating heart of the gate, now held a charity afternoon thrown by the woman the gate had been designed to exclude. No one seems to have remarked on the irony. By then, there was hardly anyone left who remembered enough to notice. There is a small telling coda to the whole matter of names. Allene had spent a lifetime putting on the surnames of husbands as she climbed. Near the end, one of Anson Burchard's nephews did the reverse. A man born Seth Rosewater changed his own surname to Burchard in order to inherit and, as the phrase of the day went, to keep the name alive. In her world, a name was a thing you could put on and take off, buy your way into and be bought into. She had understood that since she was a girl on the wrong side of the Tew mansion. She sold Beechwood in 1952. In her last decades, she moved with the seasons the way the 400 always had, wintering in Palm Beach, keeping an apartment in New York, crossing to the villa on the Riviera. That New York address was an apartment at number 740 Park Avenue, a building later called the most powerful residential address in the city, the kind of door that once would have been closed to her. She died on the 1st of May 1955 at her villa on the Riviera, far from Jamestown and from Newport both. Of the 5 men whose names she had carried, 2 she had buried, 2 she had divorced, and the 5th, Count Kotzebue, outlived her by 11 years and died in Paris. They buried her not among any of the great names she'd married, but beside her own mother and father, in a quiet cemetery in Nice, and then the money did the last thing that money does. 6 cousins she had barely known went to court in Newport to fight over what she had left, and the sum they fought over, the same 20 million that had opened this story, was more money than that little probate court had ever before been asked to divide. The money that had begun as a gambler's thinning balance that had been dunned by a card sharp over a fresh grave had outlived every husband, every child, and every gatekeeper who had ever made her wait at a door. The money outlived them all? It is tempting to tell Allene Tew's story as a triumph, the stable girl who beat the 400 at their own game and lived to own their favourite room. It is just as tempting to tell it as a warning, the woman who bought her way into every gilded space and lost one by one every person who might have made those spaces worth entering. The honest version is that both are true at the same time, and that she never seems to have chosen between them. She kept climbing, past every grave and through every gate, until the last gate she walked through was the one that had been built to keep her out. She owned it, and there was almost no one left alive who had known the girl from the stable to see her standing in it. If the people the gilded world let in through the back door and then tried to forget are the kind of story you want more of, stay with the channel, because that gate has far more names behind it than the 400 ever wanted counted.